The Women's Prize for Nonfiction Longlist was announced last week, so I thought I'd go over the nominees, see what sounded interesting, and add to my TBR. I'm Veronica, and this is the Reading Chronicles. First is Daughters of the Bamboo Grove, China's Stolen Children and a Story of Separated Twins by Barbara Demick. So the publisher says, on a warm day in September 2000, a woman named Zanhua gave birth to twin girls in a small hut behind her brother's home in China's Hunan province. The twins, Fangfang and Shuangji, please excuse my pronunciation, I know nothing about pronouncing Chinese, were welcome additions to her family, but also not her first children. Living under the shadow of China's notorious one-child policy, Zanhua and her husband decided to leave one twin in the care of relatives, hoping each toddler on their own might stay under the radar. But in 2002, Fangfang was violently snatched away. The family worried they would never see her again, but they didn't imagine she could be sent as far as the United States. She might as well have been in another world. Following stories she wrote as the Beijing bureau chief for the Los Angeles Times, Barbara Demick embarks on a journey that encompasses the origins, shocking cruelty, and long-term impact of China's one-child rule, the rise of international adoption and the religious currents that buoyed it, and the exceedingly rare phenomenon of twin separation. Today, Esther, formerly Fangfang, lives in Texas, and Demick brings to vivid life the Christian family that felt called to adopt her, unaware that she had been kidnapped. Through Demick's indefatigable reporting, will the long-lost sisters finally reunite, and will they feel whole again? It goes on to say, a remarkable window into the volatile, constantly changing China of the last half-century and the long-reaching legacy of the country's most infamous law, Daughters of the Bamboo Grove is also the moving story of two sisters torn apart by the forces of history and brought together again by their family's determination and one reporter's dogged work. Well, that sounds fairly interesting to me. I don't know a whole lot about China's one-child policy, aside from only one child could be born. And I know that that has obviously had a negative effect on female children who were born. And that policy has since been rescinded, I believe. Yeah, this sounds like a great read. Probably going to add this one to my TBR, and I'll keep a TBR counter up here. Next is The Finest Hotel in Kabul, A People's History of Afghanistan by Lyse Doucet. I'm also not sure if I'm pronouncing the author's names right. Please forgive me for any mispronunciations. This is the story of a hotel, the story of a nation. When the Intercontinental Kabul opened in 1969, Afghanistan's first luxury hotel symbolized a dream of a modernizing country connected to the world. More than 50 years on, the Intercontinental is still standing. It has endured Soviet occupation, multiple coups, a grievous civil war, a U.S. invasion, and the fall and rise of the Taliban. History lives within its scarred windows and walls. Lyse Doucet, the BBC's chief international correspondent, has been checking into the Intercontinental since 1988. And here she uses its story to craft a richly immersive history of modern Afghanistan. It is the story of Hazrat, the septuagenarian housekeeper who still holds fast to his intercontinental training from the hotel's 1970s glory days. An era of haute cuisine and high fashion, when Afghanistan was a kingdom and Kabul was the Paris of Asia. It is the story of Abida, who became the first female chef to cook in the Intercon's famous kitchen after the fall of the Taliban in 2001. And it is the story of Malalai and Sadiq, the 20-something staff who seized every opportunity offered by 2 decades of fragile democracy, only to witness the Taliban roaring back in 2021. The result is a remarkably vivid history of how Afghans have survived a half-century of destruction and disruption. It is the story of a hotel, but also the story of a people. So I'll admit, I really like books about historical events that tell the story through the people who lived it. So not just a list of dates and events, but how the people actually experienced these historical events. So this one's probably going on my TBR. Next we have Don't Let It Break You, Honey, a memoir about saving yourself by Jenny Evans. So the publisher says, cast in a cult film at the age of 18, Jenny Evans was on the cusp of something extraordinary, a route out of her hometown, a future of promise. But the new world she was exploring crumbled around her when she was assaulted at a party by a high-profile figure. Jenny reported this crime to the police when she became aware of other allegations of violence against the famous man. Shortly after doing so, details of what she had experienced were printed in a tabloid newspaper. Jenny trained as a journalist herself to try to find out how this happened. In the aftermath of devastation, she picked up the pieces and fought back against the systems that caused her harm. Her investigation helped expose the jaw-dropping press abuse and police corruption we now call the phone hacking scandal. Now training as a lawyer, Jenny is still working to fight for justice in a system that so horrifically fails its victims. Don't Let It Break You, Honey is a reckoning, a personal, fiercely compelling account of power, who holds it, who wields it, who is silenced in the process. It asks urgent questions about fame, justice, and the institutions we have no choice but to trust, while offering something even more profound, hope. Because this is, above all, a story about resilience, about finding your voice when the world wants to silence you and refusing to let them win. I haven't heard of this phone hacking scandal, so I am not at all familiar with the details of this case. But I did really enjoy reading She Said, which came out several years ago, and that was about the Harvey Weinstein case. And this sounds very similar. I'm sure that we won't find out who the famous man is. We probably know this person, but it will be very interesting to read about how the author, put the pieces of this case together and learn more about how what happened to her was part of the press. So this is going on my TBR. Next is Art Cure, The Science of How the Arts Transform Our Health by Daisy Fancourt. So this is a groundbreaking expose showing how the arts, alongside diet, sleep, exercise, and nature, are the forgotten fifth pillar of health. From cradle to grave, engaging in the arts has remarkable effects on our health and well-being. Music supports the architectural development of children's brains. Artistic hobbies help our brains to stay resilient against dementia. Dance and magic tricks build new neural pathways for people with brain injuries. Arts and music act just like drugs to decrease depression, stress, and pain, reducing our dependence on medication. Going to live music events, museums, exhibitions, and the theater decreases our risk of future loneliness and frailty. Engaging in the arts improves the functioning of every major organ system in the body, even helping us to live longer. This isn't sensationalism, it's science. The results of decades of studies gathering data from neuroimaging, molecular biomarkers, wearable sensors, cognitive assessments, and electronic health records. From Professor Daisy Fancourt, an award-winning scientist and science communicator and director of the World Health Organization's Collaborating Center for Arts and Health, this book will fundamentally change the way you value and engage with the arts in your daily life and give you the tools to optimize how, when, and what arts you engage in to achieve your health goals. The arts are not a luxury in our lives, they are essential. So, I think anyone who reads regularly knows that the arts are important. I mean, literature is an art, just like painting, just like dance, just like music. And we understand how reading a good story can change your mood, can transport you to another world. Certainly, you learn a lot from reading, but it also has a great effect on how you feel. So, the idea that things like music and dance and magic can do that too isn't super surprising. But I think this type of study is necessary because arts education has always been at risk. Schools are always under the threat of losing their arts programs for classes that will be tested. Arts aren't tested. You do not have to pass art to move on to the next grade or to graduate from high school. And because so much is dependent on what tests students pass based on the state sanctioned tests, arts often fall by the wayside. So while I don't need to read this book to be convinced of the importance of art, especially as we grow older, it's so important to keep our brains engaged. I'm probably going to read it to learn more about it and have an even more nuanced argument about why the arts are so important. Next is With the Law on Our Side, How the Law Works for Everyone and How We Can Make It Work Better by Lady Hale. Told through captivating real cases in real courts, the former president of the Supreme Court leads us on a deeply entertaining and vitally important top-to-bottom tour of the law in our land. I should mention that this is the UK, not the US. Our laws and justice system might touch our lives when we have an accident, a wrong is done to us, or we have a family difficulty. They are vast, ancient, and cover everything from the personal to the regulation of our government. But to most of us, they are a web of intimidating institutions and practices. Lady Hale, an inspirational figure admired for her historic achievements in activism, shows us how the law is on our side. Taking us into the complexities of real courts and real decisions, we see that we all have rights: school children, disabled people, workers, minorities, and patients. Here are true stories from every part of the justice system, from lowly benefits tribunals and magistrates' courts to the lofty heights of the Royal Courts of Justice and the Old Bailey. I don't know what that is. Stories about the dilemmas of deciding what is right and just, and which invite you to say where justice lies before knowing what the courts decided. We see firsthand how the people whose needs the law is designed to protect actually experience it. With the Law on Our Side is a citizen's guidebook to the law in our land, a top-to-bottom tour with a supremely expert guide. In captivating stories, it tells us what the law is about, how it works, and most importantly, why we should all care about it. I admit this sounds really interesting. I know very little about the law, particularly in other countries, but I think we could all do to learn more about it. I don't know that I'll add this to my TBR, but it is definitely a book that has piqued my interest, and so I might mark it for later investigation. Next, we have To Be Young, Gifted, and Black, Creativity and Race in the 21st Century by Kadiatu Kanneh-Mason. So what does it mean and how does it feel to grow up as a Black artist today? When Kadiatu Kanneh-Mason's eldest daughter, Isata, made her solo debut at the BBC Proms in 2023, she could not have been prouder. Watching years of hard work transform into a transcendent performance was profoundly moving, both as music lover and parent. All fractured when her younger daughter turned to her in tears a few days later, having read online abuse about her sister. Isata, it was declared, did not deserve to be there. How do you prepare your child for the fact that no matter their talent, technique, or dedication, they will be told they do not belong? Through conversations with her extraordinarily gifted family, Kanneh-Mason explores what it's like to come of age in these turbulent times, when Black artistic self-expression is so often met with disparagement and online abuse, and offers a hopeful, powerful way through. So books about race are always interesting to me. As a person of color, I'm always interested to learn more about how race is experienced by other people and how society makes judgments based on race. I just read Cast earlier this year, so I don't know that I'm quite ready for another book that is so much about race. So I'll mark this for later investigation, but it might come back around to my TBR. Now we have another book about art. This is Artist Siblings Visionaries, The Lives and Loves of Gwen and Augustus John by Judith Mackrell. In this book, acclaimed biographer Judith Mackrell turns her attention to British brother and sister artists Gwen and Augustus John. I'm not familiar with these artists. In many ways, they were polar opposites. Augustus was the larger of the two, vivid, volatile, and promiscuous. He was a hero among romantics and bohemians, celebrated as one of the great British talents of his generation. As a woman, Gwen's place in the art world was much smaller, and her private way of working and reserved nature meant it was only long after her death that her tremendous gifts were fully acknowledged. That is so often the case with female artists, or in general, women who have contributed greatly to their fields. So it goes on to say, but her temperament was as turbulent as her brother's. She formed passionate attachments to men and women, including a long affair with the sculptor Rodin. Okay. And there were other ways in which the two Johns were remarkably alike, as Mackrell vividly reveals. The result is a powerful portrait of two prodigiously talented artists and visionaries whose experiments with form and color created some of the most memorable work of the early 20th century. I'm not too big on biographies, and while the practice of art definitely interests me, as I mentioned earlier, I don't know that I'm super interested in reading a biography of artists, so I'm probably going to skip this unless it wins the prize, in which case I'm going to learn more about these two artists. Next, Ask Me How It Works, Love in an Open Marriage by Deepa Paul. In the early hours of dawn in Amsterdam, Deepa Paul rises from her boyfriend's bed. She gets dressed, slips away with a kiss, and cycles home, where she is welcomed into the arms of her husband, whose contentment is mellow alongside her own. There isn't a glimmer of shame, deception, or guilt, only the honesty and compassion needed to make this kind of life possible, even if it wasn't always this easy. You might have questions. That's what the publisher is saying. Whose idea was it? What are the rules? Are you ever jealous? In this memoir, Deepa offers her answers openly and tenderly as she explores the truth to questions of her own. Can I ask for what I want and still honor the life I have chosen? Do I deserve it? Is it worth it? Unexpectedly relatable and joyfully vibrant, this is one woman's story of discovering her own desires and how to liberate them, of shifting identities from mother to lover and back again, and of finding the courage to ask for the marriage she wanted beyond the marriage she had, one question at a time. So I'll say that explorations of relationships, whether that's romantic relationships, friendships, family, are always interesting, especially when they don't fit the mold. They don't follow the prescribed, in this case, monogamous relationship that we assume all romantic relationships follow. So while it is interesting to learn more about how people navigate deviating from the norm, I don't know that I'm too interested in learning more about people's relationships in particular. I'm not really the kind of person who always wants to know how another person's relationship is going. I just don't think it's the most interesting thing. That's my personal opinion. So I'm probably not going to read this book. Next is Death of an Ordinary Man by Sarah Perry. Sarah Perry's father-in-law David died in the autumn of 2022, only 9 days after a cancer diagnosis. He was in some ways a very ordinary man. He loved stamp collecting, fish and chips, comic novels, and his local church. Yet as Sarah and her husband Robert nursed David through his final days, they realized how extraordinary he really was. This loving, clear-eyed, and unforgettable book shows how death may be met and understood as part of life, a universal experience that is terrible and beautiful, intimate and real, sometimes all at once. Memoirs of people who have passed, I think, always have the ability to connect with the reader. To a certain extent, this is something that we will all experience if we have not already experienced it. So it's bound to connect with a lot of people. That said, I don't know that I'm super interested in reading this type of memoir. It's not really the type of memoir I tend to read. I may pick it up one day, but this one I'm probably going to give a pass for the moment. And next is The Genius of Trees, How Trees Mastered the Elements and Shaped the World by Harriet Ricks. For a supposedly stationary life form, trees have demonstrated an astonishing mastery over the environment around them. In The Genius of Trees, tree scientist, I did not know that was a specialty, arborist? Is that the same thing? I don't know. Tree scientist Harriet Ricks reveals the inventive ways trees sculpt their environment and explains the science of how they achieve these incredible feats. Taking us on an awe-inspiring journey through the history and unseen biochemistry across the globe, Ricks restores trees to their rightful station, not as victims of our negligence, but as ingenious, stunningly inventive agents in a grand ecological narrative. Trees manipulate fundamental elements, plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, and even humankind to achieve their ends, as seen with oaks in Devon, England, shaping ecosystems through root networks, and fungi, and in Amedi, Iraq, changing sexes as they age. Laurel rainforests in the Canary Islands regulating water cycles, and metasequoias in California influencing microclimates. Some trees have gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure their fruits reach large primates who can spread their seeds over vast distances while poisoning smaller and less useful mammals. Others can split solid rock and create fertile ground in barren landscapes, effectively building entire ecosystems from scratch. And new discoveries are constantly coming to light. Research has shown that trees have an even greater role in preventing global warming than we thought. Trees, at one time thought to produce methane, actually consume it. We share one world with trees and one need for survival. This eye-opening journey into the inner lives of nature's most powerful plant is a profoundly new and original way of understanding both the miracles trees perform and the glories of our natural world. All right, so this is the kind of science book that I'm interested in. I mean, we walk past trees all the time and don't really think much about how they contribute to our environment aside from providing shade and looking pretty and, perhaps producing fruit. But beyond that, we don't really think about how they have evolved, how they have caused us to evolve in certain ways. And I think that learning more about that will, just be a really interesting deep dive into the science of trees. So this goes on my TBR. The next book is Hotel Exile, Paris in the Shadow of War by Jane Rogoyska? Not sure with that one. The Hotel Lutetia, I also don't know how to pronounce that, is a Paris institution, the only grand hotel on the city's bohemian left bank. Ever since it opened, it has served as a meeting place for artists, musicians, and politicians. André Gide took his lunch here. James Joyce lived in one of its rooms. Picasso and Matisse were regular guests. It has a darker history, too. During one short period, it became a focus for some of the most dramatic and terrible events in recent history. In the 1930s, the hotel attracted intellectuals and political activists forced to flee their homes when Hitler came to power, who met here with the hope of forming an alternative government. But when war came, Paris was occupied and the hotel became the headquarters of the German military intelligence service and the center of their operation to rule out the enemies of the Reich. In 1945, the hotel was requisitioned once more, this time transformed into a reception center for deportees returning from concentration camps. Hotel Exile is about what happens on the edges of a war. At its heart are three groups of people connected to a place, to one another, and to the dark ideology which dictates the course of their lives. A masterpiece of empathy and concision, Jane Rogoyska's extraordinary new book offers us a vision of individual human beings desperately trying to find a path through some of the 20th century's most devastating events. Ooh, so like the previous book, this seems to be more about history as told through the people who actually lived it, and also through this building that seemed to be a huge part of many things that happened during World War II. Now, I am not a fan of reading World War II historical fiction. There is way too much of it. But reading actual history about World War II, that is something I can get behind. So this is a book that I'm probably going to check out in the future. Next is Mother Mary Comes to Me by Arundhati Roy. Mother Mary Comes to Me is Roy's first work of memoir, a soaring account, both intimate and inspirational, of how the author became the person and the writer she is, shaped by circumstance, but above all by her complex relationship to the extraordinary, singular mother she describes as my shelter and my storm. Heart smashed by her mother Mary's death in September 2022, yet puzzled and more than a little ashamed by the intensity of her response, Roy began to write to make sense of her feelings about the mother she ran from at age 18. Not because I didn't love her, but in order to be able to continue to love her. And so begins this astonishing, sometimes disturbing, and surprisingly funny memoir of the author's journey from her childhood in Kerala, India, where her single mother founded a school, to the writing of her prize-winning novels and essays through today. With the scale, sweep, and depth of her novels, The God of Small Things and the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, and the passion, political clarity, and warmth of her essays, Mother Mary Comes to Me is an ode to freedom, a tribute to thorny love and savage grace, a memoir like no other. Now, I know this book has gotten a lot of press since the time it has been published. I feel like it has also already been nominated for an award, although I can't quite remember which one. I have not read any of Roy's work despite having owned The God of Small Things for a really long time. I should probably read that at some point. It's somewhere up there behind me. But this memoir, initially, not knowing much about it, I thought, well, it's just a memoir about a person's mother. Not always the most interesting to me. But this idea that Roy had to leave her so that she could continue to love her, that has me intrigued. What exactly does that mean? And how did that affect their relationship? How does she think of her mother, knowing that she had to do this in order to be able to continue their relationship? So while I have never been interested in this book, despite all of the attention it has gotten, I don't know. I might have to read it. I think it's also probably a pretty big contender for the winner. Next we have Finding Albion, Myth, Folklore, and the Quest for a Hidden Britain by Zakia Sewell. Zakia Sewell is on a quest for another Britain. Traversing the length and breadth of our island from Somerset to Scotland, she's seeking out a different story, one that lies beyond divisive national myths and symbols. In Finding Albion, Zakia uncovers an alternative spirit of Britain that is vividly alive today. It is found in otherworldly folk songs, ancient legends, Celtic seasonal rites, and mystic stone circles that punctuate our landscape. Her journey begins as the sun rises on the spring equinox over Glastonbury Tor, where she meets neo-pagans reclaiming traditions from our pre-Christian past. At Summer's Peak at Notting Hill Carnival, she hears cultural echoes that passed along the slave trade routes from the Caribbean. On All Hallows Eve, she encounters the ghosts of empire that are still haunting the nation, and in the depths of a Cornish winter, she asks if today's new folk revival could reunite our increasingly divided country. Finding Albion brings a hopeful story of Britain out from the shadows, giving us a deeper sense of who we are and heralding the promise of a brighter future. So I don't know a whole lot about Britain's history in the terms that this author is writing about. I think that I would learn a lot here that I don't already know. That said, I don't know that British history in this sense is at the top of my priority list in terms of books that I want to read, so I'm probably going to give this one a pass for the moment. Okay, we have To Exist As I Am, A Doctor's Notes on Recovery and Radical Acceptance by Grace Spence Green. It wasn't a car crash, but there was a collision. He fell from the 3rd floor. At the age of 22, Grace Spence Green's spine was broken at the 4th thoracic vertebra, and her life changed tracks. One day she was in hospital supporting patients. The next she was one. To Exist As I Am traces Grace's journey back to the wards and back to herself, as words like recovery, independence, and community, well and unwell, took on new meanings. She asks how we might fight for change while joyously embracing life exactly as we are. So that's it for the book description, but I thought the author note was also interesting. It says, Grace Spence Green is a junior doctor working to challenge the narratives surrounding disability, medicine, and identity. In 2018, age 22 and a 4th-year medical student, she sustained a spinal cord injury and is now a full-time wheelchair user. Since her life-changing injury, Grace has become a passionate advocate for the disabled community, appearing in the BMJ and Guardian and across TV and radio. So this is an automatic add to my TBR. Reading this description makes me think of the episode of W. Kamau Bell's United Shades of America, where he talked about the disabled community. And the thing that he pointed out that most of us don't think about, and I certainly had never thought about before, is that the disabled community is a minority, but it's unique among minority groups in the sense that it's one that any of us could belong to at any point in time. And we're more likely to belong to it as we age. So while we treat people with disabilities as other, we could easily become them. Like, you're not going to change your race. You probably won't change your sexual orientation. Some people change their religion. Some people change their gender identity. But even doing that puts you in a minority group. But we could all become disabled, and it could happen to us tomorrow. It could happen to us in the next hour. We never know when that could happen. So reading more about this doctor's journey with her injury and how she advocates for the disabled community in her work is something that I think we all need to know more about. And I think this will be a really enlightening read. All right, the next book is Nation of Strangers, Rebuilding Home in the 21st Century by Essie Temelkuran. From the internationally acclaimed Turkish author of How to Lose a Country, The 7 Steps from Democracy to Fascism, this is a personal exploration of exile and a galvanizing new vision of home. Dear stranger, are you home? Do you feel at home? For how much longer? Across the world, the number of refugees and exiles, the dispossessed and displaced, the politically homeless and the economically excluded is growing. In the decades since she left her own home, the author has been a political Cassandra, warning those convinced it couldn't happen in their country that fascism is coming. Now, as oppression spreads and temperatures rise, as we face competing crises and learn again and again that no institution is so concrete it can't turn to dust, and no home is too strong to be destroyed, she has written Nation of Strangers, a series of letters from one stranger to another. Politically attuned and deeply personal, this extraordinary, hardening correspondence is a gift to treasure in uncertain times. As poetic as it is precise, it is a book for anyone who feels alienated by an ever more monstrous world. It shows how, as we all become strangers, our home will depend on the strength we find with one another. Oof, I did not think that's what the book would be about based on the title. I guess I thought it would be about the idea of home itself. I mean, it is about home, but the idea more of the place where we live, instead of the idea of the country we call home. And certainly with everything happening in the world, and especially with immigration continuing to be a hot button issue, but even more so in recent days, this idea of home and how we treat refugees and people who have been exiled from their lands is an important thing to investigate, an important thing for us to read about, particularly those of us who have never immigrated, those of us who have always, to a certain extent, felt at home in the country where we live, have never felt that we could be pushed out of our homes. And I think it's important to keep in mind the idea that fascism can come to any country. We are not immune to it. It could happen here. So will this go on my TBR? I don't think so at the moment. I think it will be an important read, but I'm going to mark it for perhaps something to investigate later. Next, we have Indignity, a life reimagined by Leah E.P. When the author discovers a photo of her grandmother, Lehman, honeymooning in the Alps in 1941, posted by a stranger on social media, she is faced with unsettling questions. Growing up, she was told all records of her grandmother's youth were destroyed in the early days of communism in Albania. But there Lehman was with her husband, Aslan, glamorous newlyweds celebrating while World War II raged. What follows the author's discovery is a thrilling reimagining of the past, spanning the vanished world of Ottoman aristocracy, the making of modern Greece and Albania, a global financial crisis, and the horrors of war and the dawn of communism in the Balkans. While investigating the truth about her family, the author grapples with uncertainty. Who was the real Lehman? What made her move to Tirana as a young woman, where she met a socialist who sympathized with the Popular Front, while his father led a collaborationist government? And what prompted her enigmatic smile in the winter of 1941, one of the darkest periods of World War II? By turns epic and intimate, profound and gripping, Indignity shows what it is like to make choices against the tide of history and reveals the fragility of truth, collective and personal. Through secret police reports and communist spies, court depositions, and the author's memories of her grandmother, we move between present and past, archive and imagination. With what moral authority do we judge the acts of previous generations? And what do we really know about the people closest to us? Okay, this is going on the TBR. Like I mentioned earlier, books about history, but that look at them from the lens of the people who actually lived it, are super interesting to me. But also, the description here really makes me think of Feeding Ghosts by Tessa Hulse, the graphic memoir that won the Pulitzer Prize last year and was one of my favorite books of the year. The author working to figure out who her grandmother really was, especially in terms of the Chinese Civil War and how that affected all people living there, was particularly interesting and a great way to learn more about China's history. So learning more about World War II through this person who discovers this bizarre photo of her grandmother that she didn't know existed I think we'll put a really interesting spin on what could otherwise be just a very straightforward narrative about the war. So that I am really looking forward to reading. All right, those were all 16 books long listed for the Women's Prize for Nonfiction. The short list will consist of 6 books and will be announced on March 25th, and the prize will be announced on June 11th. Have any of these books captured your interest? Let me know in the comments below. See you in the next video.